We must be bad people. Next month, no fewer than 5 human rights experts from the United Nations will spend 2 weeks here judging us. These 5 people, chosen by the UN's Human Rights Council, are going to check our apparently appalling habit of just jailing people arbitrarily, just like that. And weird, though, they're coming here and not, say, China or Cuba, but I guess there's something you need to know about this Human Rights Council. Look at the kind of countries that get voted onto it. They include dictatorships and totalitarian regimes and authoritarian ones like China or Cuba or Saudi Arabia or Venezuela and Egypt, and they judge us? Well, they particularly judge Israel. Their obsession with Israel is insane. A year ago, for instance, this Human Rights Council had a session discussing 5 resolutions condemning Israel, which happens to be a democracy, but not one attacking China or Cuba or Saudi Arabia. And the man who's probably done more than anyone to expose this extraordinary bias, or should I call it anti-Semitism, is Hillel Neuer, head of the Geneva-based UN Watch. He's in Australia for a lecture tour, and I spoke to him earlier. Hillel Neuer, thank you so much indeed for joining me. Anti-Semitism, right? How bad is it in the United Nations? Give us an example. For instance, I've really been troubled by the Human Rights Council there, right? It's supposedly in charge of protecting the human rights of everyone. It's got an upcoming session in just, 4 weeks' time, for the first of the year. And I thought, well, if it's going to talk about human rights, it's got to be about China, right? Or, one of those tyrannies. Israel, number one. What's the problem here?
Well, that's true. I think we need a bit of a context to understand who the Human Rights Council is. And I want to start, Andrew, with the good news. The good news is that China, Cuba, and Saudi Arabia, after 6 years on the Human Rights Council, and they've really been there forever, are mandated to take 1 year off under the terms of the Council. So that's the good news. The bad news. The bad news.
How on earth did it happen that China, Cuba, and Saudi Arabia
have been basically permanent members of the Council, except every 6 years when they must take 1 year off? And that is despite the insistence of so-called human rights champions like Ken Roth of the group Human Rights Watch, who claimed when the Council was created in 2006 that poor countries with awful human rights records, will not be elected to the Council. And since then, China, Cuba, and Saudi Arabia have effectively been permanent members, other than this 1 year that they have to come off.
So China, the biggest tyranny in the world right now.
China, which has more than 1 million Muslims locked up in prison camps, and 50 Human Rights Council ambassadors signed a letter praising China for its treatment of these Muslim Uyghurs after they put 1 million in camps. So it's the most cynical forum you can imagine, which turns human rights on its head. George Orwell could not have imagined a more Orwellian body. And I mentioned the countries who came off. The new countries that have just been elected include Venezuela's Maduro regime, a regime that destroyed his country, sent more than 4 million people in exile. Families are sifting through garbage to get food. That country was just elected to the world's highest human rights body, along with Libya, which is a failed state that tortures migrants, Sudan, whose leader has been, who just ousted and wanted for genocide, Mauritania, which still has slavery affecting up to 500,000 people, Pakistan, Eritrea, and the list goes on.
And the joke of it is, countries like Australia, of course, are subjected to the Human Rights Council. We held up to account by this council. Australia's human rights record is being judged by the likes of these countries. But so is Israel. Now, I've had a look at the agenda for
upcoming session, starting in a couple of weeks. Yep.
It's got 9 or 10 points.
That's
Israel's number 1. The only country singled out for a specific treatment.
That's right.
Is this atypical?
No, sadly.
Is giving you a leading question?
No, sadly, this is a permanent fixture of the Human Rights Council. It's something that Kofi Annan, the former Secretary General, Ban Ki-moon, who succeeded him, had promised they would remedy. That of 10 agenda items in every single session, the one in September, the one we're going to have beginning at the end of February till March, and the one in June, always begin every meeting with 10 items on the agenda. Only one country has its own agenda item. So there's item 4 for all countries in the world, to address human rights situations, and Agenda Item 7 on Israel alone. No other country in the world, not North Korea, not Syria, where 500,000 people have been slaughtered, not Sudan, where there's been genocide, they don't have their own agenda item, only Israel. What we see this is something that claims to be concern for Palestinian human rights, but which in fact is a very cynical subversion and perversion of human rights to single out the only Jewish state in the world. And it's using modern forms for a rather ancient hatred, which you talked about.
The reason for this UN obsession on Israel, do you think that's in part because so many Arab nations or Muslim nations have so many votes at the UN Council, then there are so many left-wing governments or regimes that cozy up to them, and then of course there's the oil factor that gets even more people saying, "Oh, we'll support you. You scratch your back, you scratch ours."
Absolutely. There's a lot of... I think that explains a lot of it. You have those who initiate the anti-Israel resolutions are the Arab and Islamic states. There are 56 Islamic states. There's one Jewish state. So countries vote at the UN. They say, well, there's 56 countries that will trade with me. The UN works by cynical vote trading. You vote for me, I vote for you. 56 Islamic votes will go for your country if you go along with their anti-Israel resolutions, plus the oil, plus sovereign wealth funds, billions of dollars that could or could not go to your country if you vote the right way. I would say also, Andrew, fear of terrorism. Some countries fear that if they decide to buck the trend, maybe they'll be targeted by Islamic terrorist groups. And finally, I have to mention that some of the European countries that I see going along with these votes don't always seem compelled by the oil, the money, or the votes. Some of them seem content to point their finger at the Jewish state. And living in Europe, a place where when there was the Black Plague, the European reaction was to accuse the Jews of poisoning the wells. And today in some circles,
speaking of that, I want to
Israel
ask you
is accused of that.
Exactly, or something very similar to that. But before that, that last bit, the number of European countries that have gone weak on Israel and go along with this demonization of Israel, brackets Jews, how much of that is due to the fact that immigration is brought to their countries, sometimes, proportions of something like 10%, nearly approaching 10% Muslim population, that they're too scared to outrage some of their own?
I think it's a part of it. Look, Europe is a place where when the Nazis murdered 6 million Jews, too many, not all, but too many European countries were complicit, whether it was the Dutch, whether it was the French. You can pick your European country and you really have to find the exceptions, the Danes who, saved the Jews, and the Bulgarians saved the Bulgarian Jews, but not the others. But otherwise, most populations went along. There were righteous Gentiles who saved Jews in all of these countries, of course. So Europe has a dark history. It's a mixed history, of course, when it comes to it. So I wouldn't say that the Europeans need the anti-Jewish hatred that's coming from the Muslim world, but no question there is now an alliance that you could have radical left elites demonizing Israel, along with more uneducated immigrants coming from the Muslim world, who will be the ones who will beat up Jews on the French street.
Hillel. I think it's also that they simply, some governments are too weak. They don't want to provoke what they think is a radical and dangerous minority in their own country, so they go along with the demonizing Israel. Plus, of course, there's more Muslim voters in their countries than there are Jewish voters. Hillel Neuer, you're doing tremendous work looking at the UN Human Rights Council for 15 years now. Thank you so much for dropping in.
My pleasure. Thank you.